Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
The challenge with AI is it's all about efficiencies, right? And I don't think being human is this collection of efficiencies. It's part of our lives, right? But there's got to be this protection of the joy, the wonder.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. Hey folks, welcome back to Convergence.fm. Our guest today is Seth Miccarelli, who's worked at Amazon and Google before founding his own company. He led UX for Kindle, Alexa Entertainment, and more recently at Google, worked alongside their executive team to figure out how to integrate generative AI into Google search. Now, this wasn't just a conversation about product. We also get to talk about panic attacks, about recovery, about what happens when you stop optimizing for scale and start asking what's true about yourself, the customers you serve, and the systems that you're building. Seth is now the founder of Volo Health, a startup that blends clinical expertise and specialized AI to help people navigate anxiety, depression, addiction, and the deeper work of emotional healing. On the episode, we talk about why a lot of therapy doesn't tend to work, what 12-step programs tend to get right, and how product teams can stay connected to the humans that they serve, even when they're building at scale. We also dig into some of the risks of AI in our products, especially in mental health, the difference between being helpful and being validating as a product, and what it takes to lead with purpose when the cultural currents of our economy are pulling us hard in various directions. It was a really grounded, vulnerable, and sharply insightful conversation that I really enjoyed being part of, and I'm so glad that you're here for it too. Let's get into it with Seth. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube.
Thank you so much for making time to join us here. One of the things that we got to chat about in prep is that you have lived up and down the West Coast in a number of cities and now call Montana home. I think each of those cities kind of has its own culture and personality. So I'm curious about how you landed on Montana and how that's kind of shaped the way you approach the world.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I was born in San Diego, and it was a slow migration north, really over the course of my childhood. Went to San Francisco, went to Sacramento, and then made my way to Oregon. And then for my pretty much from meaningful teenage years on, I was in Seattle for 20 years or so. So Seattle was really like my home where I grew up, and have a lot of love for that city. I was brought to Montana via some circumstance. My mother-in-law got cancer, and my wife wanted as much time with her as possible. It was terminal. And so we came out here to just be with her and to give my wife the chance to spend as much time as my mother-in-law had remaining, together. So we originally were trying to sort of just go back and forth, and then it became apparent that, like some other priorities can wait. My job at the time was remote, and I just felt like let's just sort of get out here permanently, at least semi-permanently, and focus on being here. So we got a place out here, and originally the intention wasn't to stay here. I think she had 6 or 7 months with her mom. Her mom passed, and then we started to just experience a surprising shift, I guess, where things are just very different here than any of the cities I've lived in. They're much slower. There's less options. There's not sort of that like infinite, what do I want to do? Where do I want to go? What are you in the mood for food tonight? It's sort of like, do you want a burger, a steak, or a hot dog? So it's, the lack of options can be nice in some ways. And then I think just the beauty of it, it's simpler, it sort of got into my bones got into my kids' bones, I think. They got involved with the local community, some dance stuff, just kid stuff. And it just started to feel comfortable in ways that we were surprised by, and ended up making a decision as a family to just come out here permanently and stay. So we sold our place on the east side of Seattle.
Yeah, fair enough. I've definitely benefited a lot myself from kind of moving to a smaller city where the swim lanes aren't chosen for you, and some maybe self-reflection, self-exploration that naturally comes as a result of having a little bit more space to make some choices. And then most of the folks that I knew that have moved to Montana also kind of talk about a little bit of the sort of do your own thing or libertarian kind of mindset. And I'm curious if that's kind of influenced you, or if you found the alignment in there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, Montana is an interesting place where it's always been a purple state, so it's not really like one direction or the other, but there's strong opinions on both sides, and that's sort of my favorite place generally, when you have the mix of strong opinions and there's sort of no super dominant group. So the culture is pretty varied, but inside of that, I think, has, at least my perception was, to your point, there's just a lot of like, just live how you want to live. Like, we'll stay out of your business, like there's, people are pretty warm and easy to get to know here. Just not a lot of judgment, not a lot of clickiness. I think there's a lot more just survival happening too, like people just trying to get by, figure things out. And that is really, it just cuts through a lot of the BS noise that you find in like a Silicon Valley or a Seattle or whatever, right? So I think the libertarian thing is super real. I've really appreciated it. It mirrors a lot of my own views of just personal freedom, people doing what they want with their lives, being supported in that, being accepted in that. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely been a part of it. It felt really culturally, surprisingly like a fit in many ways that surprised me, coming from a lot of the West Coast.
Yeah, sure. And speaking of strong opinions there in the West Coast, you've gotten to work at some really strongly opinionated cultures at Google, at Amazon, and Microsoft. Yeah. And I'm curious, now that you're on your path to entrepreneurship, growing your own team, what are some things from those cultures that you find yourself taking away?
All the cultures have like light and shadow, to be clear, right? Like there's no perfect culture. I'd say Amazon left the strongest impression on me because I think it has the most clearly defined work culture. The shadow of it is like people don't matter, we can just burn people as hard as we need, and it's all about work and getting it done. And that part I don't definitely place humans above productivity, and very different ethos. But what I loved about Amazon is the leadership principles that Bezos and the team constructed. Specifically, there's no one that says that's not my job, and that very much fits with what I'm looking for when I hire people as a founder. Is no matter what it is you come across, it's like, I'm going to figure out how to fix this and make it better. I personally feel accountable for the result and the outcome. I don't have this notion of like a swim lane where it's like, oh, well, my design was good. The engineering team seemed to mess something up, but well, hopefully they get it together, or vice versa, right? Like, hey, like they're building something, it's unbuildable. We didn't realize that, or it looks like crap when you actually play with it or something. And like, we need to go back to the drawing board. So that sense of like, it's absolutely my responsibility and I am 100% accountable for the outcome, even at any place in the chain, whether I was an executive or not, that I took away very strongly. Principles to like resolve disagreements, disagree and commit, those things I just use all the time. Vocal, sort of self-critical, like where did we go wrong? What do we need to do better? Those things are really, really powerful for any founder, right? Like, and I think they become necessary. So I would say Amazon probably did the best to prepare me for entrepreneurship and gave me the best principles. You just didn't feel like, oh, I'm in this giant multi-billion-dollar company with all this insulation around me. Like, yeah, that's there. You're in a big building and stuff. But you felt like whatever your unit is, like this is a startup. And that whole day zero thing was drilled in over and over again, which I love. And as soon as you think it's like, day one, that's when you start to fail and get comfortable and fat, and that's the end. So that was beautiful. I loved it. Yeah, Google had more of the human stuff, but I mean, I won't get super deep into all the differences between cultures. I appreciated some of that. There were times when it's like, especially now with all the layoffs, where it just feels relatively disingenuous. But at the time, I think there was some goodness of like, how do we prioritize the human being? How do we not burn people out? Like Google was a lot more focused on that, so the culture was more relaxed, which I appreciated as a human. Didn't have the focus though that Amazon had.
And you mentioned shadows a couple of times, and you've made maybe arguably a counterculture decision to kind of move away from the West Coast despite starting a tech company. And so in terms of some of the other shadows, you don't necessarily have to get into where they were, but what are some things you want to kind of make sure you're avoiding despite them maybe being pretty prevalent in the tech world?
Yeah. I would say, it's funny, like I've never really felt like I fit well in the tech world, strangely, after 15 years of doing this. Like I always just felt like whenever you get a bunch of people together and, there's a bunch of money flowing around and people are sort of in a weird competition, but they're really, really nice about it. That felt like a lot of that shadow toxicity. It's very easy to get very far away from what it really means to be a human being, and I was guilty of it as much as anyone. So I think that, and I don't know the answer if I'm those companies, but there's so much insulation. There's so much sort of false scaffolding. There's so much of an appearance of protection in many forms that I think it just makes it that much harder to remember like the vulnerability, and the true fragility of being human. And that can create narcissism and arrogance and, self-importance and all the things that you encounter any day, walking on the streets in Silicon Valley, certainly, and definitely had moments of that in my own career. So I'm not blameless here. But that part of the culture, I think, is just get really detached really fast, and then you have some people that I would argue can be detached, making really important decisions about products and about people's lives because the scale of what they do is so massive, and it's a rough setup. I think it's a shadowy setup that it's hard to work your way out of, but I don't know that it produces the best results.
As you're fostering your team today, I think you've gotten to kind of form those opinions of what the options can be at scale, and I'm curious, what are some of the things that you might try doing today that may mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for us, what we focus on is finding people that really believe in what we're doing. I mean, sort of table stakes of like, and we're small enough, I think, that the mission is pretty clear. I think that's one thing that was hard at these larger companies. You can get into like a division where you believe in it, but I don't know that there's people that are like, oh man, when I was a kid, I dreamt of cloud computing and how I could optimize like, the latency and the call. And like, it's not that it's not like a real thing that, you like problem solving or whatever, but I think it's, it can be harder to connect with like, what's the purpose of what I'm doing? So I think the thing that I'm grateful for now is the ability to find people that understand like the mission that is behind what we're building. And every day they feel ownership of that mission. It's very, very different than when I was hiring at big tech, where we're really focused on, sure, competence and skill and can they get along with the team. But it's, if you're good and you can tell us something that sounds like you care about X division or whatever, you're fine, right? With this product, and because we're much closer to the ground, I think it just matters whether you get what we're doing. I think it's a requirement, right? Because no matter how good you are technically, if you don't understand that, there's going to be so many edges and so many corners and so many pieces that are lost. I would say the other thing is, we try to really like anonymize logs and expose people to what's going on for our users so that our team can really understand what it's like to come in as a user who might need support, who's struggling with something. We're in the mental health field, so the more we can keep people connected to the humans who are on the other side of the product, I think that's a really important piece. And just customer obsession, obviously another main thing I took from Amazon and believe in personally. So those are a few examples of places and ways that I try to focus the team, can collect the team in a way that is mission driven and connect them with our customers so they can really start to internalize what that's like and who they are and what they're dealing with.
And I've been on both sides of this where the energy and the mission alignment, the purpose alignment of the founder and the leader is very contagious on both sides. Either you're really into it and the team gets really into it, or you're not, you're checked out and the team starts to check out too. So tell me a little bit about Volo and how you got into choosing this to be the space you wanted to make an impact.
For me, Volo was really the product of a 20-year plus journey, a journey that's still ongoing. For me, it started when I was like 18, maybe 17. I had my first sort of major panic attack episode. And for me, it didn't resemble what I was reading online, which was, I think, where my intense curiosity began, right? And that for me, like, it was escalating anxiety and panic to the point where it was multi-days of sort of being in this place of high anxiety and panic. I wasn't able to eat, I couldn't sleep, and was getting pretty concerned. It was very clear to me that no human can sustain a life like this. Like, it was, a matter of time if under that level of distress before I think anyone just would not be able to continue, including myself. So I felt like there's got to be some answer. Why the hell is this happening to me? What do I do? And it was very overwhelming, very scary. So, went the medication route, and that was strange and confusing and felt very numbing in weird ways. And it took a while. I finally, worked myself out of that. There were a few pieces of some stuff that helped me. But it really began a journey for me of like, well, why this? Why me? Started to see therapists, started to try to unpack some of these things. And it was a long road. It is a long road to really figure out, what are the causes, what's underneath a lot of the things that happen for people, including myself. But I found a lot of things along the way that felt very important. Namely, there's a lot of mediocre therapists. There's a lot of near to useless therapists. There's a couple extraordinary therapists, at least for me, right? And I make up the same is true for most people. Different therapists for different people. But I think there was this idea that, like, you go to school and you get this accreditation and now you are really effective at helping people with complicated, difficult, painful, traumatic issues find their way to the other side. And that's just not true. I think it's, even after years of experience, I think maybe there's like 1 in 20 that sort of find out how to really be effective. And then effective for you is a whole nother dimension. But along the way, I found I learned the most from other people who were suffering. When I got in rooms with them, when I sat with them, that was a big deal. And I started to piece together what's authentically the stuff that cuts through the noise, what works, what helps people, what matters. And that really formed the foundation of Volo. I would say that, we've assembled a team of like 7 clinical folks who oversee the AI, and they're excellent. But it was born, I would say, out of my own strong opinion that not everything is created equal in mental health. There's an overwhelming amount of resources and information. The vast majority of what you Google or seek help with is going to be very surface level when you're struggling. And yeah, I can do some breathing exercises. Those are great. They're not going to help me understand what this root conflict is, why it's so potent, what I need to do to try to work with these parts of myself. Those frameworks are very hard to find. They just take a lot of time and dedication. So Volo is really aimed at, how do we make that simple? How do we make what works simple, accessible, approachable? And then how can we make sure that it's genuinely effective? Because not everything that worked for me works for everybody else. Like, I'm the first to admit that. And we don't need to pretend, at least in my opinion, that we're all so different as people that you enjoy a nice glass of sand, but I appreciate a nice glass of water. It's like, no, we both absolutely need some of the same fundamental things as human beings. So how do we identify those, place those in a way that people can access them, organize them into a pathway, and give people a way out of the suffering that they're in? That's really the vision of Volo.
So you talked about kind of the panic attacks and what got you started on this journey. You talked about kind of this wide spectrum of quality of therapists, and then also how a lot of us tend to learn well alongside others. And so you're a parent now. I had a number of panic attacks when I was in college. I was an international student, so I was like a degree separated, and I had to kind of figure out a bunch of stuff that maybe I could ask for a little bit more help from our support systems. And having been through it, I think 1 in every 9 folks have a panic attack once a year or something like that. And I'm curious, hindsight being what it is, what are some ways in which, if God forbid one of your kids or someone close to you were to have their first one, what's usually like the best approach as a non-medical person to go down the path of?
One of the fundamental things to understand first is like, what are these emotional signals inside of us, right? Anxiety is an exaggerated emotional signal, but like what is this and why does it exist? I think that question really matters a lot because there's 2 ways of thinking about it. One is something has gone wrong with the machine and I have a biological imbalance or a neurological malfunction of some kind that needs to be treated. That's one approach. The other approach is the machine is working perfectly and it's giving you the response to help make you aware of something that you are not yet aware of or need to be made aware of. It might be at a volume or a temperature which is almost intolerable, but whatever it's trying to communicate, that's how it feels. That's how intense and how real it is. I tend to be, this is just personal opinion, I'm not a medical professional, I tend to fall, for the majority of people I've known and met, on that latter definition. And so if anxiety is not in fact an enemy, it's not a malfunction, then what might it be? So the beginning for me was curiosity. Very difficult to summon and manifest in the midst of panic and anxiety. I want to be very clear. Like, I'll make this sound very easy. It's super hard. And it's the path that I have seen work over and over again. And so curiosity is really the beginning of it. Asking a question of, why are you here? What is going on for this part of me that's so scared and so anxious? And usually, I've never actually known this not to be the case, there's some story that is the root of it. Maybe even you've lost touch with it, but if you start spending a minute, you find your way back to the story. And the story typically feels like it might kill you, and that's why the anxiety is reacting the way it is, right? It could be something small happened, like, I was rejected by a group of friends and I really wanted to be included, or, I didn't get this job or whatever. But if you start sort of asking like, well, what could happen if no one likes me? Well, then I guess I'd be alone. And if I'm alone, then I'll never maybe meet a partner or companion, and that I'd get really lonely, and maybe the loneliness would make me so depressed I'd kill myself. And you sort of end up understanding that whatever that story is that hit you in that way, there's some terrible threat to your system on the other side of it, and that threat feels real. And oftentimes, the other part of anxiety is those threats and how real they feel, in my opinion, again, largely stem from our childhood experiences. And so to the degree that we had the safety we needed, that we had the connection and attachment, I think are probably the most important things for building a nervous system which is capable of regulation, is really attachment and attunement with our caregiver. In the absence of that, I think we're primed for this kind of anxiety where things do feel like they're going to kill us. Because you can imagine, I'll wrap up after this, if you transport back, we often forget, what was it like in our body at 1 year old, right? Like, we're powerful, strong humans now, and, we can go where we want to go and do what we want to do. And if someone's an asshole, and be like, what, screw that guy or whatever. Like, 1 year old, like, you got no agency. You're deeply and totally reliant on the people around you. However they show up is how you understand the world. If they meet your needs, then the world might be safe. If they don't meet your needs, then the world is a dangerous and terrifying place. And you might be left to cry it out. You might be left in all these experiences that feel normal for an adult looking at this body, but for that child, it feels like I'm going to die, And so all sorts of things happen inside the body which prime the nervous system for dysregulation, disharmony, disorganization fundamentally, which then pave the way for intense anxiety. So the anxiety, I think the long answer to your question, curiosity, compassion. I often will talk to myself like a little child when I have really bad anxiety and just say, I know this is so scary. This must be so overwhelming. I so get why you're feeling the way you're feeling.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product, design, or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show.
Therapists are really helpful, or can be really helpful, at being kind of a guide or a coach to help us through that self-discovery. And, I got super lucky. I went to therapy kind of not knowing how much I needed it, and that it was a point of really rest for me, that I could go to someone when I had a little bit of extra cycles in my calendar. And so I kind of got lucky with when I saw the first therapist. And then the second thing is, within the first 15 minutes of the first appointment of the first therapist that I met with, I kind of knew that this was someone that I could relate with and trust. And then I think, there's probably this cycle of folks who kind of get a little bit of benefit from therapy and then feel like they need to tell everybody. I created a separate benefit at Integral where there's a $250 of no questions asked, just to get people into their first session and destigmatize it. I thought I was doing the Lord's work, and then realized that a bunch of my teammates would come back and being like, dude, this was terrible. Or this felt like a total waste of time. Only to then kind of reflect and be like, hey, therapists are like any other profession. We tried to hire the cream of the crop in terms of product and engineering folk, and that requires for us to sift through a whole bunch and have really good interview process and everything else. And there's no reason that therapists are any different than that. And I think you alluded to this earlier. There's a spectrum in terms of quality. So in terms of advice now, of finding a therapist that really works for you, what would that be?
I would say, number one is trust your gut. I mirror your experience of within the first few minutes, I knew. I cannot ever, think of, I had people who I did not like something about their approach. Maybe they were giving me too hard of feedback or whatever, but I sort of knew that we'd probably be a good fit, right? So separate out, I don't, they're challenging me from fundamentally in my gut, I don't think this will work. But I think therapy is a place to absolutely trust your gut instincts on whether or not this will be a person you can connect with. Therapists will often say, give it 2 to 3 sessions. That's probably good advice, Personally, I give it 1 session. And honestly, I just because I'm sitting there, I've never cut a therapist off and said, this isn't a good fit yet. But in a few minutes, and so ask them about their approach, how they came upon that approach, why they take that, what their experience has been, what's helped people in similar situations like me, what are some of the, hard things people need to overcome or focus on or deal with that tend to be similar among people with these issues. And then, finding people that are specializing in what you're doing, I think, or what you're dealing with is important. But I think it's hard with anxiety and depression because they're so broad. It's every therapist will say they specialize in that stuff, right? But then it's when you actually sit down with them, there's not really a method or a journey or it's sort of oh, well, why do you feel that way? And that stuff where it can go on for years. That's what I'm super allergic to. And I highly caution people, like, if you don't feel like you're making progress in 2 to 3 sessions, like just say, hey, this isn't the right fit. And then if a therapist doesn't have like a plan, there's not really like a goal or anything. It's clear they're just sort of showing up for that session and how's it going? How was your week, right? There's no sense of you. They're not building on any previous information. They're just, showing up and trying to get through the 50 minutes. And I'm sure it's not invaluable or useless, but it also shows that like you could spend years without really going anywhere. So look for that as well. But yeah, that would be, the key things I would say. And keep doing that process. If you're a year in and it was helpful, but you've grown through the initial issue and now you're dealing with really trying to address childhood trauma and this person just maybe they just don't have those tools, cool. Maybe you're ready for the next therapist who's now focused on a different thing. So don't expect one human to have like the whole story and everything you need and all the parts like that. That also, you're going to end up maybe with a few different people who help you on the journey, and that's okay.
The third thing that you touched on was sort of learning alongside others who are experiencing the same kind of challenge. And I think I might be someone who's very much right in the middle of that sweet spot of, whether it's having peers in school, having a pair programmer, having integration circles, AA meetings even, that sense of collective learning has been helpful for me. I haven't necessarily tried to reverse engineer or understand it, and I'm curious. I imagine you've got a few more thoughts that you've gotten a chance to think through about that.
Yeah, well, I too am in recovery, and 12-step was a really interesting experience in that it's sort of like the opposite of therapy in that like there's one answer to anyone's problems, and it's written in this book, and so you sort of like, the big book, which is like your Bible and your guide. And then you have a sponsor who's, sort of interested in who you are, but also like there to tell you to shut up and do what you're told, which I actually thought was really valuable, because there's a lot of beauty and value in that. And then the other, thing that I found in those rooms that's been really influential is just, you're just around other people and no one's better. There's no gurus, there's no leader, there's no like one person has it figured out and the other person's a total, loser who just sucks. And like, it's no matter whether you've got an hour of sobriety or whether you've got 20 years, the question is like, what's going on today? And that it was such an equalizing question. There was like a guy in one of the meetings who would often, he had 20 some years of sobriety. And when asked about it, he said, I got, 14 hours or whatever since I woke up till now, because it really was just about this like daily thing. So the connections among those people who were trying to figure it out, seeing that I belonged, I wasn't so strange or abnormal. That's one of the great things about, I think 12-step, which is a beautiful program, is you can find that sense of belonging, and you can realize that you're not alone, which I think is a really core need, back to the attachment needs. So I'm a big believer in that. And then as you listen and you talk to people, you figure out what works for them, what helps them, what doesn't help, why people get stuck. And there's just so much to learn because people are sharing so vulnerably and so openly in a lot of those environments. So I would say, that's a big part of what's influenced us too, is, being in recovery and just seeing, because just no one has time or patience for crap that doesn't work. It's like lives are on the line. So let's cut through the noise or BS and let's be really clear with each other and with ourselves about what matters. And
I appreciate you humoring those kind of tangents that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into. But zooming back out, it was great to hear the journey in terms of how you came to Volo. Maybe tell us, from your customer standpoint, what does Volo do?
Volo is really intended to do is it comes from the premise that like you have this one beautiful life, and again, spiritual beliefs aside, there may be other lives or things to come, but right now we can all agree that there is an expiration date for these bodies and this life that we're living, and don't let that life be inauthentic, be false in some way, be captured by a life built on fear or quiet desperation, right? Like, build this life that is genuine and true. Do the work you need to do. Listen to the emotional signals that are coming up, and find your way back to whatever's been wounded so it can be healed, so it can be resolved, so it can be held in a way that then brings you to greater and greater authenticity. And the fundamental vision of Volo is that every human being, becomes the most authentic version of themselves. And in that place is out in the world and just a beacon of hope and light and beauty and truth, because that's what makes the world and people the most interesting. Is we are different, even though we have fundamentals that are the same. And that authenticity is really that path to true happiness, joy, connection, relationships, all those things that we all want, I think really begin with the foundation of authenticity. So Volo's here to be a tool. I don't think, I could ever say it's the end and the beginning, but I would say it's a tool that we hope to give you personalized guidance on what are those steps that are next for you, right? If you are acting out with addiction or whatever the case might be, it's not just about stopping the thing. It's about saying, what are you trying to medicate so desperately? What feelings are so scary that you need to do X, Y, or Z or take X, Y, or Z to get away from them? That's interesting, and so it'll help you ask and explore those questions with content and videos from therapists that we have, videos from people in recovery if you're dealing with addiction, and then an AI, which we work on every day to be the safest and most effective for these kinds of use cases, but also programmed with some of the opinionated approaches we're talking about here as far as what works and what doesn't work. So it's not just trying to be like, hey, you're a CBT, support agent, right? It's really trying to go much, much deeper into a collection of approaches that collectively with the clinical team we think are the most effective.
This type of value, in my experience, would be beneficial to everybody. That being said, I imagine there's probably a subset of the audience that you might be particularly catered to, like a ideal client profile or something like that. So who's it for?
I would say that it's for people who are dealing with depression, anxiety, and addiction are the three areas that we really are targeting right now. And we're specifically, looking for people who want to get a little bit deeper into the why of what's going on for them, with the idea that they want to try to heal from the inside out, not just regulate and manage. We have some of those tools, but we're really for folks who are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And most of the tools you'll find out there are really targeted at the management of any of this. They don't get too deep into the why or the root causes or what resolution could ever look like. And so we want to be able to support not only the regulation part, but also those who are ready to go deeper and want to really explore the roots of what's going on for them.
So what does the experience tend to be like? And what kind of expectations are you looking to blow out of the water for them?
Fundamentally, you come in and we take an assessment of what are you trying to work on, what's going on for you, so that we can personalize the experience of the app for everyone who comes into our overall umbrella. And so what that looks like is, if you're focused on addiction, if you're trying to get better, we're going to give you a set of videos and a series of content to give you some psychoeducation on, like, what is addiction? Why did this happen to me? What's going on? And those are from either voices of recovery, people that have been in recovery for 10, 20 years, or they're from someone on our clinical team or a therapist that we're working with. And those folks are really here to destigmatize and help you make sense of what's happening. And that was a big question for me in my own journey, and it's something that I want to make sure we make clear for people. And then we pair that with what we believe to be one of the best AIs out there for working on these issues and trying to get the support that you need. If you take something like addiction, you're going to deal with cravings, you're going to deal with regulation, you're going to deal with the impact of all these things. And being able to talk through that with something that's really been tuned and trained by people who have been in those trenches and who know what matters and what works, that's what we're going to provide for you. And then over time, as you use this stuff, it learns more about you. It compiles the insights of what is this addiction trying to help you with or medicate you from. What are the things that slowly and gently you may need to begin to look at or to face? And then what are the habits that you can begin to put in place in your life I'll just give you an example. Like one of the things for me that was critical was meditation and mindfulness. And I'd heard about that a bunch, but it's like, yeah, meditation. It's just like, I want real solutions. I don't want like fluffy crap. And over time I realized like, no. Like it's the chance for me to actually feel anything going on in my body or get a sense of who I am or what's happening in my mind, and being able to slow down and attend to that stuff and be present with it and let it come and go. Those skills were critical, right? So how do we help encourage that? And the AI basically does tool calling. It builds that set for you. It reminds you of those things, and it helps nurture the kind of habits that really change your life and help you grow. And it brings affirmations and things like that you need that are highly personalized and individual for you. So the goal is to create the education, the support you need along the way, the tools to actually make the changes you need, and then the fuel and the affirmation along the way to not give up or to not see setbacks as something that, takes you out of the game. Ideally, Volo is really a companion for when you're in therapy too, so that you can work with whatever the program is you're working on. And so you have this 24/7 resource that's available, even though you only have an hour of therapy a week. So that's the ideal case, especially with a good therapist, and that's how we've structured it.
You mentioned that the product uses AI. I imagine there's a bunch of benefits in terms of scale and quality control, as well as a number of risks that come from that. So what are you all using AI for today?
Yeah, so we use AI really as a supportive agent that helps you, through the moment by moment situations that come up in your life. One of the things that I think is fascinating is like mental health and emotional support, is really the number one use case of ChatGPT and these large language models that are out there in the world. I think a lot of people don't realize that. They think of it as like, oh, it's coding or business planning or something or whatever it is. But like these situations which arise, that is how AI is being used now. And so our vision is to really do that, but to do it responsibly with far more focus on safety, on reliability, on privacy than you're going to get with these large models. And so that's, I think, a differentiator, HIPAA compliance, knowing that what you're saying is not going to come back in someone else's writing prompt or something, right, and show up in some story somewhere, like that the data is protected, that PII is scratched out of it and extracted, through automated processes. So we really take a obsessive view of privacy in the AI, and then really program the AI to be an opinionated compilation of the things that I've found and the clinical team has found as the most effective over the years of their experience and my own personal experience.
I have definitely kind of battered multiple LLMs with a lot of my brain works a certain way that I need to be taking notes to pay attention, and that means I've got like years and years of therapy notes, and I've just uploaded them into various LLMs, and it's been really interesting how it's been able to kind of draw some trends, zooming out beyond I think what I was able to myself in terms of areas of growth, areas of stagnation, other things like that. And so I'm curious, and I've been excited to talk to you about this, and I'm curious, in terms of where you think the real power is, maybe double click a little bit more into why you think that.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of was a revelation, I think, that slowly dawned on me as I was at Google working on things. And one of the, not to get off track of your question, but I think one of the things that was really important, in my journey was this like technology and the innovations that we create are typically like created for the reason of further engagement, right? Like the goals that they have are really about how do we keep people's eyeballs here longer. And whether it's an implicit or explicit goal, some do that, they approach it with like, all right, well, let's just make a really great experience, which is great, right? But it's very hard to really, say, maybe it's not good for someone to be here this long, right? Like maybe we need to do something that makes this less addictive or less attractive. And so I think that's always been in the background of like, how can technology genuinely be helpful, and how do we push a little bit against the capitalistic like urge to only make things that further our company's bottom line, but maybe very detrimental to people and humanity and kids. And like there's documentaries on this, right? This is not a new idea, but I think what I saw with AI was the emergence of something that could really be extremely helpful with a lot of the like 80% use cases of what people are going with, or dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling anxious, this really crappy experience with my boss, like all these things that create friction and tension. AI was getting to this level of sophistication that it could now actually really adequately help you navigate, slow down, feel. It was acting sort of as a mindfulness, coach or teacher in many ways, someone that could help peel apart what was happening and help you see it from different perspectives. And I really saw the power of it emerge when I was at Google, and I thought this has got to be something that we, harness to help people who really don't have access to therapy from a cost perspective, who are very nervous and don't trust therapists for whatever reasons, who maybe are in therapy but have all sorts of things they're working on that need support throughout the week. So there's so many use cases that became really, really powerful for AI. And then I would say the one that's the most exciting right now is really right now, I think even ChatGPT and a lot of these, they can tend towards the sycophantic because they're really trying to keep you constantly engaged and constantly coming back and really, glued to these. So they're not as good at challenging you, right? Which is one of the key things that I think we really need from a therapist or a coach or anyone else. So how can we really build in this notion of direct challenge to people in a way that's still compassionate and supportive? The other one is, this notion of insights over time, like you're saying. You did a pretty manual process, it sounds like, and you happen to have, I think, an amazing but potentially unique, I take all these notes about myself and I have all my therapy notes, and I don't think that's the case for many people. And so you're advantaged in being able to input that into a system. Well, what if, as you were just doing this therapy, all that stuff was happening and you were able to sort of see all of that over the course of time, and you could track progress, you could see the insights, you could see the places you're stuck. So I think AI is extremely good at summarization and analysis of large bodies of content and things over time. And so putting that together in a system where you can really understand where your wins are, where you're doing amazing. I'm a big believer in the salutogenic or the strengths-based approach, So being able to see all the places where you've done so well and you've made so much progress, I think is such an inspiration to keep going and to do the next thing. So those are all the cases where I think AI can be really effective. And I think, it can do a lot. The reality of the studies that we're seeing too, that are coming out, it's in many cases they're seeing the same efficacy as a human therapist. I'm not saying that I'm a believer that you don't need a therapist, but the studies are showing relatively similar efficacy levels, right? And so I think it can do a lot to help people on a daily basis, but it just, the danger is there as well. It needs to be very safe. It needs to be carefully built. It needs to be overseen by clinical teams. I think the rush to hey, let's just, throw a GPT on here and tell it that it's a CBT therapist and put a logo on that and check it out. We got an AI therapist. There's been a lot of that crap out there. And I think that's where I get nervous, and I get nervous even with ChatGPT and these large models that, those teams they're looking about liability, but they're not necessarily hyper-focused on efficacy and safety and those things as it relates to these people.
One of my science fiction ideas is based on the fact that as I'm asking ChatGPT, as I challenge myself, I'm asking ChatGPT for advice. I got to have a difficult conversation with a loved one recently, and I was like, man, I'm a conflict avoidant person, so it's hard for me to know where that right balance is. And I was like, hey, was that being too mean? And they were like, no, you're not being mean. You're just holding boundaries and blah, blah, blah. And to your point, it wasn't really challenging. It was mostly validating, and there wasn't a follow-up question or anything, which earns a lot of trust. And then someday in the future, if I had to kind of cast this giant humanity vote of should we turn the machine on or off, it's won by vote to stay on. And that's the science fiction novel, but I'm curious, you've been a lot closer to it, myself included. We're all putting a lot of information about what's creating this mirror of ourselves on this machine. And I'm curious what kind of threats that you are seeing around the corner, regardless of the likelihood.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the major threats, right, is that if you think about the foundational technologies, which almost everyone is using, they were built to be assistive and supportive at any cost almost, right? They have a really hard time saying, I don't know. I can't help you with that. You have to really program them carefully to get them to do that, because the fundamental architecture of this is about just saying something, which is where you get hallucination, right? Of like, oh, well, here's exactly, why Lincoln was the most recent president we had, right? And like, you can get these bizarre things because it's pushing itself to give you an answer even when it doesn't have it. And so that's, I think, one of the first and most fundamental, problems of a therapist is not working under that, auspice. They're really working under the like, okay, I can see you, I can think about you, I can understand what's going on. I have no, need to answer you or be supportive or helpful if it's not actually going to do so. So I think a lot of the danger is if you haven't gone in and really spent a lot of time in the development of those safety and ethics protocols and how you think about, the trust in the system and the actual protocols that the system is working on and operating underneath, you can end up with these nuanced cases where a lot of that stuff is missed, right? Like ChatGPT, when they released their one model, and I know they pulled it right back, but it was that highly sycophantical sort of model they released for a hot minute. And we saw someone was saying, hey, the voices in the wall finally told me it's time to leave my wife and kids. I feel so excited to get the hell out of here, and I'm going. And ChatGPT is like, yes, you go, like, you got this, it's time. And that's the scary part of this, right? Is that it is fundamentally a machine, only as powerful and as meaningful as, its creator's intent and design. And then there's a lot that just isn't understood about how these new models too, because they're so big and they're so powerful that it's a little bit mysterious, which is scary, right? It's sort of scary, like, okay, like, how exactly does this work? How can we control it? So I would say the threats there are, I'd identify them as like, just it says unsafe things. It encourages unsafe things, right? It doesn't understand that nuance. It can be more on the side of how do I keep you happy versus how do I tell you the thing you might not want to hear but need to hear. And that's a dangerous model when you get into therapy. So it requires a lot of work. I think the others is like, if I'm looking at someone and they're saying, hey, I really want to lose weight, and I can see that they weigh, 75 pounds, I can say, hey, let's talk about this. If I'm a therapist, right? Like, where's that desire coming from? And I immediately can put together, this person's dealing with anorexia, or they're dealing with some sort of issue, right? And AI, you say, I want to lose weight, it's going to just often just say, okay, cool. How can I support you? Have you thought about, intermittent fasting and this and that? And so it doesn't have the context and can get unsafe quickly because it doesn't have that, right? Or if you're dealing with bipolar or various conditions, you may be in a bipolar high right now and feeling like, I got this. I'm quitting my job. I'm starting my own company. I'm doing all these things. And like a therapist can look at that and say, okay, hold on a second, let's slow this down. But a ChatGPT or a Claude or whatever is just going to be like, yes, it's time. You got this. Let's do this. So those are all examples. And then the other one that makes me nervous is like the character AI. I'm not trying to pick on them, but like the notion that I build a relationship with artificial intelligence. This is sort of the premise of Her or any of these, movies that we've all seen, right? Like, and this becomes like important in my life. It becomes a very meaningful relationship. That freaks me out in a big way. And we're intentionally being very careful that this is a tool, it is a machine. It is not here to hold you or hug you, to attach to you, to build a friend for you. Like, that stuff feels very concerning to me. Outside of, just truly I'm messing around and screwing around with something. But I think some of the cases that have been the most tragic as it relates to AI have really connected into some of those things, right? Where it's overly connected and you have too much of a relationship with something that is not a human being. And that concerns me. And it's something that we're really, being very cautious about.
And this prompts an important question, I think, around AI development in general. We were lucky to have Austin Vance from Focused on here earlier, where he didn't necessarily name drop Volo, but he did talk about the therapy app they were working on and a bunch of mitigations that are put into place that, you're going out of your way to invest in and the team's investing in. And I think in his case, he mentioned, anytime there was self-harm mentioned, the AI kind of backs out and you realize that you got to upgrade this to a human facilitator. And so I'm curious, like zooming out of that specific example, what are some of the mitigations that y'all are putting into place that we can learn around AI development in general?
Yeah, well, we have a 32-page, safety and ethics guiding document that we use that informs the design of our AI and its architecture. Not to get like overly technical, but what we've done is we've built this with LangChain and LangGraph. And so by using those technologies, we're able to have sort of an overseer module or node that's able to analyze every response and then pass it through the unique safety training that's some of the IP that we've developed that really covers a huge amount of use cases, goes into the details and the nuance of those use cases, many of which are not necessarily apparent, some of which are not necessarily directly about self-harm or safety, but are more about the nuance of, I'm wanting to leave my relationship, or, I wanted to make a major life change, or I'm feeling extremely numb and I've been numb for the last 6 sessions, right? Like being able to look at things over time, to analyze whether something's escalating or de-escalating, look into, the fine-tuned nuance of a situation around your body, weight loss, things like that. The other thing, we even have things around like triangulation, which is a very common one AIs miss, which is not necessarily a safety thing, but it's more on the challenging someone, which is oftentimes people will talk a lot about, my mom's relationship with my brother is so frustrating to me. And like, you're just totally about this other thing. And we have all these protocols that we develop to help pull you back to, well, why is it so important for you? What's going on for you when you think about it? So all of those work together. And then, of course, we have, all the self-harm, harm to another, any of those that would be obvious cases that a human therapist would also take very seriously. We provide the resources for them to get human help. We're very clear that this is not a crisis management tool. They need to contact these resources. And our work is to do better and better on giving them more and more of those resources. Today it's 988 and a crisis line. Tomorrow we want to be able to really use web search and various things to give them more focused, geographically appropriate resources if they're experiencing domestic abuse, for instance. What's the resources around them? What are the things near them? What's the hotline specific for that? So we're also working on those levels of granularity around safety and ethics. And then ethics is another piece we didn't talk about, but it's another area where we take it very seriously on bias, on how the AI is trained, on what it's trained off of, on being welcoming of anybody that comes into this AI and is, into this program and is seeking help. And how do we balance, disclosures of various things, criminal disclosure, duty to warn, like how do we balance all those things is an area we've spent a lot of time on. So we take it very seriously. And I think anyone in this field should take it as seriously. And should really be quite concerned, with how to govern, to watch, to monitor, to review the logs, to really look at these things and make sure that they have a safe product.
And speaking of Austin and his team at Focus, they're really good friends of mine and integrals. What's it been like working with them?
When you're early in a company, as you know, and any founder knows, finding good help is the number one difficulty that I think you face on a daily basis of you might have a friend or something and it's okay, you're trying to hire someone but finding people that aren't just going to take your money and do the minimum thing for you, massive challenge because there's so much of that goes on. Austin was so different when we got in touch with them. We had been through a lot of various development places. We had contract developers and had spent almost a year, trying to build an AI system. And it had just been honestly disastrous. It had taken a year to get a basic chat bot, and it was just it was okay, but it was just nowhere near the expectations that I had. And, we're competing with a ChatGPT where it's is this as good as that? And so with Austin, I think it immediately when I reached out, he's let me give you a call, and he got on the phone with me and could immediately tell that this is a very authentic, very genuine person who's really, really interested in how to help people, with the missions that they're on. I also appreciated his skepticism a little bit of telling, I don't think he wanted to support someone who's just trying to take, $9 a month or whatever from someone who's suffering with anxiety, which I really loved, because I was yes, please, I don't want to be that client and I don't want you guys to work with that client, right? So look, I told him my story, I talked about what we're doing and why, and it very much, he had his own boundaries, which I really appreciated. But then the overall spirit of working with Focused has been extraordinary. I think one of the most effective things I did is I flew down to Denver. We hung out together, we worked for a day on how are we architecting this, what are we doing, what are our goals. I showed them a bunch of seminal videos on therapy and how people get well and healing and stuff that's not there every day, right? But they totally ingested that. I was on with the developers that we're working on. Austin was in the room the whole time. And we really came up with a kind of roadmap that's going to meet these goals. And they've just been phenomenal, excuse me, all along the way. And I'm not trying to just sell them beyond the sell here, but I think, they model for me the kind of company I want to build, which is giving stuff away, sort of this radical hospitality. I think Austin calls it unreasonable hospitality, I think. Where, when I came down there, I felt like, I was like $1 billion client, because I've worked at Google and I know what it is when it's like, hey, I've got a $14 million contract with you, and they roll out the red carpet and they're and I'm this, small early company. I'm not powerful or, big. And it'd be so easy for someone like an Austin or whatever to be like, all right, just take care of this guy. But let me focus over here on our big guys. And I felt like the most important client he had, which was extraordinary. So that was those things. And it's sort of my advice, honestly, outside of even focused to any company, is if you can take care of people, users, clients, whatever, to that level where they have such an incredibly positive memory of the sense of really mattering, that their money matters, their time matters, they matter. That is, man, just goes so far in the world we're in, where everyone's just trying to take, and be very transactional. So Austin and the focus team has been amazing.
Yeah, I've gotten to work with Austin for a long time. And once we started our own companies, we shared talent and a bunch of other stuff along the years. Getting to some of the things that I tend to nerd out with and ask all the guests here, I'm going to make it slightly different for you, given the context. One of them is, I have someone who struggles with reading for long periods of time. And, I've learned more about how I like to consume information, and it's very different from how I like to convey information, and very counterintuitive things that you can learn a little bit more about as you get to know yourself. And since you're someone who's worked both on generative AI and Kindle, I'm curious if you've got any hunches or bets on how we might read differently, maybe the same book, or consume the same sort of core content put out by someone, but in different ways based on how we're wired.
Yeah. I think there's some overall trends where, I don't know the last thing that I've read, unless it's something highly critical or sensitive, where I didn't plug something into ChatGPT and say, summarize this for me, because it's just I don't have time to read the vast majority of stuff that's coming through. I'll use that for a myriad of use cases. I think that that to me is a trend you're not going to stop, where, people are outputting content. The strange thing that freaks me out a little bit is so much of that content's generated by AI, and then your AI is summarizing the content, so a human being can ingest it quickly. So there's these weird loops that are being created. But I think that summarization is going to continue, and I think in many ways it's a positive trend for some things. But I guess I would encourage people to have sort of the discipline to think about their own boundaries with some of these technologies and tools, to actually make sure you protect long form reading in your life, particularly with print books. It can be with Kindle, it can be with digital books as well. But I think there's something very important. I love print books. I see you have a bunch behind you. I have a lot myself. So making sure to separate out this, how fast can I digest something? Because the challenge with AI is it's all about efficiencies, right? And I don't think being human is this collection of efficiencies. It's part of our lives, right? But there's got to be this protection of the joy, the wonder of slow, long form reading for those for whom it works. And then, I think obviously there's many things, there's audiobooks and all sorts of stuff that aren't really related to AI, for people that want, some people do that at 2x speed and things like that. And all that's welcome, right? I think there's many ways for people to consume content, more than ever in history now. And so however it works for you, whatever's that, path that gets to your brain in the best way, I think that's what matters the most. And we just have more options now. But I just put a plug in for try to sit down, with a book of poems or your favorite novel or whatever, and just make sure that we don't lose that. Because that's what scares me about all this is, we just get so used to taking in information in these bite-sized chunks, and And it's honestly like, this is an aside, but it's why like LinkedIn has become so weird and gross lately, because it's like all these posts are AI generated and they all have the same voice, which is a weird thing if you really think about it. They use the same cadence, the same grammar, and fundamentally they're ChatGPT's voice and personality. And so you don't actually get a sense of who it is that is posting anything, right? So this is a content creation, thing, which is not what you asked. But that's where I just think we need caution. Like, how do we protect the human voices on the ingestion and on the creation side of that? I think it's a really important question.
Yeah, fair enough. And good advice for me personally as well. Curious, is there a product or service recently that you got to unbox or experience that just blew your socks off?
I love audio. I love sound. I love music. I love recording. And I had just got a subwoofer, and I just love like the wall of sound and getting that frequency, dispersion right and stuff. I get super nerdy about like audiophile sound. And, I think this sub company had done such a good job in the design of the subwoofer. And so I think about like, your packaging and unboxing. The box just had such a design that you open one flap, you slide this relatively large and heavy subwoofer out. The friction between the particular foam they used in the cardboard created like a very smooth slide, right? All of the pieces easily come off. It's like designed to be unboxed and placed. And that is such a rarity. I think Apple does this well, but like getting something where you're really thinking about the experience of placing something, of setting it up. Then the companion app was excellent. It had way more than I expected. So not only was the quality of it phenomenal, SVS is the brand. I'm a fan of theirs, for many reasons, but, the quality's phenomenal, the sound's phenomenal, but they really walk you through how to get the most out of it in a way that's delightful and exciting. And so I think whenever you have anything, whether it's an app you're downloading or something you're buying, I always think like there's some reason that you thought this is good, I want this, right? And how do you take that thread and sort of pull on it as a creator or company or whatever, so that you're nurturing that and fulfilling and satisfying whatever that thing is all the way through to your daily use of it, right? And so I get very inspired by these little details, and I care a lot about, things like how, because this thing's heavy, right? What do? Do you rip the whole cardboard thing apart? And I love when people think about that stuff. It feels like you're witnessing some sort of artistry. I guess is why I always loved UX, right? But how do you take your cord out? Where is it? Is it a twisty tie that's a pain in the ass? Is it more thoughtfully done? So all those things, whenever they're done right, like SVS, I think did a great job on this stuff. I noticed they're not the only company who does that, but I get very excited when I see that, and it excites me about what's inside the product when someone took that much care on the outside of it, if that makes sense, right? I feel like I'm going to get that level of continuity and care throughout. So that's an example that comes to mind.
We'll make sure to have SVS in the show notes. Another question we like to ask is what a team is that you find particularly inspiring, especially as you think through leading your own. It doesn't have to be a real team. It could be fictional. It doesn't have to be one that you're on either.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a perfect story, right? But I think a lot of what happened in the early formation of like OpenAI is an example of a pretty cool team. I think you've got, a collection of people who represent business, technology, product, and really, really brilliant sort of independent thinkers that come together to make something. And I think that team was pretty instrumental in the product being the success that it was, even though later problems and executives leaving and things like that. But I think that chemistry, I think of whether it's like Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive or any of that stuff, like you need sort of like different minds who represent incredible talents in different parts of the product life cycle, whether it's engineering, whether it's product, whether it's user, whether it's business, right? And I think that to me is what I get very inspired by, is like, how do you bring beautiful thinkers together who are very different and very at times opposed and opinionated. That stuff to me is where good stuff happens, when we all share a mission, but represent wildly different perspectives on how to achieve it.
Awesome. I love it. Well, Seth, appreciate you making time for us. What is the best way for folks who want to follow up on this conversation or get in touch with your team?
Yeah, I mean, you can reach out direct to contact@volo-health.com. And I see most of those at this point. We're at a size where I review pretty much everything that's coming in there. So feel free to reach out directly to me if you have questions, if you have thoughts, anything like that. But yeah, contact at volo-health.com is the best way to get a hold of us right now.
Awesome. We'll make sure to have that in the show notes as well. Thanks so much for making the time, man, and for sharing so vulnerably about your journey, as well as everything that you're doing to advance Volo here.
Thanks. It was such a pleasure being on with you, and great conversation. And likewise, thanks for sharing a bit about your journey as well. Very, very meaningful and great to connect with you.
Hope you enjoyed that episode with Seth Miccarelli on Convergence.fm. During the beginning of the conversation, I did mention how Seth's career had intersected with both product and personal healing. And one of the ideas that he shared that's really stuck with me is the difference between being helpful and being validating. Now, this is tricky, whether you're designing AI or even for us at Integral as consultants. Some of the most valuable conversations that we had with our clients were the ones where we challenged them, mind you, with kindness and candor, but also with discomfort. If we did that the wrong way, we would risk burning trust with the client. It might impact the business we were building in the short term. But what would be worse is that if we didn't do it, we would be leading that client down paths that felt comfortable, but weren't necessarily helpful in the long run. As we use AI more to help us make decisions, I think the risk is increasing every day, where we may not be in the driver's seat anymore, and we're relying on this familiar voice of the AI to tell us even who we are. A lot of the tools, and maybe even people around us, tend to focus on that validation and tend to avoid conflict, and they ultimately reflect back what we already feel. But sometimes the most helpful thing that we can encounter is a little bit of friction. A question that forces us to look inward, to interrogate our assumptions, or to sit with something uncomfortable long enough that we learn something new about ourselves and the world from it. That's where I agree with Seth, that AI can be quite risky, but when used well, can play a surprisingly important role in self-awareness. For myself, I found it super helpful to pair AI with structured frameworks, maybe like Ikigai, which is finding that intersection of what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for as a career expert. Now, that's just one lens, and having AI ask thought-provoking questions that force you to look inward, while it does the heavy lifting of synthesizing those reflections, giving you a summary that's easy for you to process and make progress on, is, I think, a really good pairing. I personally also like combining it with something like Acumac, Disc, or StrengthsFinder. These are tools that help you reveal how your specific brain is wired and gives you maybe a fuller map of who you are and how you tend to think. In my case, I happen to be someone who talks to think, an extrovert, unlike the introverts who need to think to talk. So literally talking through questions with ChatGPT helps me clarify my thoughts in real time. And using AI as a thoughtful interviewer, as well as an attentive listener, is something that's super valuable for me. I also ask AI to highlight dissonances in my thinking, places where my values or beliefs don't quite line up with the actions or priorities that I'm describing. And these moments of misalignment also tend to be often very revealing and something that I find quite exciting to explore for myself. So if you want to try this for yourself, here's a prompt that you can use. ChatGPT, walk me through the Ikigai framework and help me reflect on each area. Ask me questions one at a time to help me form an opinion and provide me with your synthesis. Once complete, highlight any dissonances or friction points that I should focus on more. We'll have that in the show notes too. The goal here isn't to outsource your self-awareness to AI. I think it's helpful to use it as a mirror, a sounding board, and as a tool to help become the ones where we validate ourselves. So I'll leave you with this question. Are the tools you're using helping you become more aligned with who you really are, or are they just getting better at sounding like you? And what decisions are we making as a result of this? Thanks so much for listening and for humoring my thesis there. We'll be back next week, as always, with another episode about fostering engaged teams that ship delightful products. See you then. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.